The ceremonial flame had burned cold and blue for 200 years, rejecting every noble-born Omega in the realm. But when the advisors, in sheer desperation, dragged a soot-stained kitchen maid into the sacred circle just to complete the ritual, the fire erupted into a blinding pillar of gold. For the first time in centuries, the Alpha King's mate had been found, and the entire court was staring, horrified, at the wrong woman. This is the story of Ilara, the scullery maid who shattered a 1,000-year-old tradition. In a kingdom where bloodline is everything, her selection wasn't just unexpected, it was an impossibility. It triggered a political earthquake, threatening to tear the realm apart. Because when you crown a queen from the kitchens, you don't just change a royal line, you start a war. To understand the chaos of that night, you must first understand the unbreakable rules of the Kingdom of Valerium. For 1,000 years, power had flowed through a single sacred institution, the mate's pyre. Every generation, upon his 30th year, the ruling Alpha King would undergo the ritual of flames. He would stand before the sacred fire, crafted from enchanted ironwood, and every eligible highborn Omega of the realm would be presented. The magic was simple, brutal, and never wrong. If an Omega was his true fated mate, the flame would burn a brilliant, enduring gold. A political union, yes, but one blessed by the old gods themselves, legitimizing the next generation of rulers. If she was not, the flame would snuff out the moment she stepped into the circle. For 2 centuries, it had only snuffed out. King Alastair was the 7th king in this cursed line. A warrior who had unified the fractious border lords through sheer force of will, he was a man who commanded mountains to move. But before the pyre, he was powerless. This was the 3rd and final summer of his choosing. The law was clear. If the flame found no mate by the end of his 30th year, the crown would pass to his scheming, power-hungry cousin, Lord Cedric, plunging the realm into a civil war everyone knew was coming. So the pressure wasn't just spiritual. It was a geopolitical time bomb. The royal advisors, led by the stern master of ceremonies, Thaddeus, had scoured the noble houses. They presented daughters from every major lineage, the fiery-tempered Lady Seraphina of the Eastern Vale, the cunning Lady Isolde whose family controlled the silver mines, even a politically risky candidate from the recently subdued northern clans. One by one, over 3 long years, they had entered the circle. And one by one, the blue flame had died, leaving behind the scent of cold ash and escalating terror. The day of the final ritual was less a celebration and more a funeral march. The grand hall was packed with every noble whose future hung in the balance. The air was thick with perfume, sweat, and palpable dread. King Alastair sat on his obsidian throne, his expression a mask of stone, but his knuckles were white where they gripped the armrests. The final candidate, Lady Alina of House Grenville, the most politically perfect match imaginable, stepped forward. Her gown cost more than a village's annual harvest. The silence was absolute. She took the 6 prescribed steps into the circle. The blue flame flickered, danced for a heart-stopping second, and vanished with a hollow asterisk whoomp. The sound that followed wasn't gasps. It was the low, collective groan of a realm watching its stability die. Lord Cedric, standing at the front of the crowd, didn't even bother to hide his smile. Thaddeus, the master of ceremonies, looked at his king, his face ashen. The ancient rites demanded the ritual be completed. A flame had to be struck for the king before midnight, or the succession was forfeit. But there were no more Omegas. The well was dry. That's when a desperate, blasphemous whisper began among the lower-ranked advisors. The law stated an asterisk eligible Omega asterisk must be presented. It said nothing about birth. In the frantic, panic-stricken minutes that followed, a brutal logic took hold. They needed a body, a female Omega, any Omega, to stand in the circle so a technical flame could be lit and the letter of the law fulfilled. It was a disgrace, a mockery of everything sacred, but it would buy the king and the council another year to find a solution, to maybe change the laws. Thaddeus, facing the utter ruin of everything he'd served, gave the grim order. Guards were sent not to the noble galleries, but down into the belly of the palace. To the kitchens, the laundries, the sculleries, find an Omega, any Omega, drag her here. Ilara was wrist-deep in lukewarm, greasy dishwater when the royal guards found her. She was 17, an orphan whose only inheritance was a crushing debt to the palace kitchens. Her world was one of scorching ovens, the clatter of copper pots, and the constant, sharp commands of the head cook. She was a figure of soot and service, her only mark of distinction being the rare, latent Omega designation noted in the palace's servant rolls, a detail of utter irrelevance to her station. She didn't understand the rough hands that pulled her from her sink. She fought, panic-stricken, as they hauled her through corridors she'd only ever cleaned, her stained apron flapping, her hair coming loose. She was brought before Thaddeus in a servant's passage behind the grand hall. He looked at her like she was a piece of flawed livestock. Without ceremony, they scrubbed her face with a coarse rag, not to clean her, but to make sure the soot wouldn't choke the sacred flame and invalidate the already farcical ceremony. No one offered an explanation. She was a prop. The great doors opened. Ilara was thrust forward, stumbling onto the polished floor of the grand hall. 1,000 eyes turned to her. She saw the sea of jewels and silk, the contemptuous stares of the noble-born Omegas whose fine slippers she probably polished. She saw the terrifying bearded king on his throne, his eyes like chips of winter ice. And she saw the dead, cold ironwood brazier in the center of the room. The laughter started first. A low, cruel ripple from the nobles who understood this was the kingdom's final, pathetic joke. Thaddeus, his voice hollow with shame, intoned the ritual words for the last time. His Majesty, King Alastair of the blood of the first wolf, stands ready, let the flame see its vessel. A priest, looking sick, struck a spark onto the sacred tinder. A weak, blue flame sputtered to life. The signal was given. A guard gave Ilara a shove between the shoulder blades. Trembling barefoot and leaving smudges on the pristine marble, Ilara walked toward the circle. This was it then, her life's culmination, to be a punchline in a royal tragedy and then be cast back into the dark, probably punished for daring to tread the sacred floor. She stepped over the engraved silver boundary into the circle of power. She closed her eyes, waiting for the nothingness that had taken the ladies in silk. The flame didn't go out. It changed. A collective, sharp intake of breath made her open her eyes. The weak blue fire was swirling, deepening, turning a luminous, impossible amber. Then, with a sound like a thunderclap contained in glass, it exploded upward. A roaring, triumphant pillar of solid, radiant gold light shot to the vaulted ceiling, bathing the entire hall in a warm, dazzling glow. The heat was immense, but it didn't burn. It felt like a summer sun. The golden light danced across Ilara's shocked, soot-streaked face, illuminating her like a coin fresh from the mint. For the first time in 200 years, the mate's pyre had found its queen, and it was pointing directly at a terrified kitchen maid. The silence that followed was more profound than any that had come before. Every rule, every assumption, every power structure in the room had just been vaporized by that golden flame. King Alastair slowly rose from his throne, the stone mask gone, replaced by a look of utter, world-shattering shock. Lord Cedric's smile had melted into a rictus of pure fury. Thaddeus simply sank to his knees, his mind broken by the divine contradiction he was witnessing. But the ritual magic wasn't finished. As the golden flame roared, a secondary, more terrifying reaction began. The ancient engravings on the floor of the circle, dormant for centuries, ignited with a searing white light. Tendrils of power snaked out not toward the king, but toward the assembled noble houses. They connected to the crests on their robes, on their rings, fizzing and sparking where they touched. And then, one by one, starting with House Grenville, the crests dimmed. Their magical light, the source of their ancestral rights and land claims, winked out. The golden flame had not just chosen a queen. It had, in that single moment, begun stripping the nobility of their power. And that's when the real screaming started. Chaos is too gentle a word for what happened next. The grand hall erupted into a cacophony of shouts, accusations, and genuine terror. But King Alastair heard none of it. His entire world had narrowed to the column of golden fire and the girl standing at its heart. For 3 years, he had felt nothing before the pyre but cold rejection. Now a seismic physical force slammed into his chest. It was the mate bond, ancient and undeniable, snapping into place with the force of a crossbow bolt. It wasn't a gentle pull, it was a command. His wolf, a presence he kept locked down with iron discipline, howled in triumph inside his mind. He was moving before his council could react, striding down the dais steps. The crowd parted before him, not out of protocol, but out of primal fear. The power radiating from the bond, from the flame, from his own unleashed presence, was a tangible wave. He stepped into the circle, the golden light washing over him. For the first time, he looked at Ilara, truly looked at her, not as a servant or a prop, but as the other half of his soul. Her fear was a living thing in the air, but beneath it, he sensed a stubborn, resilient core, the same core that had survived the kitchens. Without a word, he shrugged off his heavy ceremonial cloak, the one lined with royal ermine, and draped it over her trembling shoulders. It swallowed her whole. The act was possessive, protective, and sent another shockwave through the nobility. The king had claimed her. In the sidelines, Thaddeus, the master of ceremonies, was having a quiet mental breakdown. He stumbled to a scribe, clutching the young man's tunic. The archives, go, I need every scroll on the mate's pyre, every prophecy, every line about the flame's color. There must be a precedent, but there was none. The golden flame was a myth from a time before recorded history. The dimming of the crests, however, was a catastrophe with immediate, violent consequences. Lord Cedric found his voice first. He stormed to the edge of the circle, ignoring the searing light. This is an abomination, a trick. That filth has tampered with sacred magic. He pointed a shaking finger at Ilara. She is a spy from the southern clans, sent to destabilize us with dark sorcery. His accusation was ludicrous, but it was a rallying cry. Murmurs of agreement rose from the nobles whose crests had dimmed. Their fear was curdling into rage. Alistair turned his head slowly towards Cedric. The king's eyes, usually a cool grey, now swirled with molten gold. You question the verdict of the gods themselves, cousin? His voice was soft, but it carried over the din like a blade being drawn. You stand in the light of a miracle and call it treason. Take one more step into this circle, and I will interpret that as a challenge for the crown you so desperately crave. It was a direct, public threat. Cedric paled, his own alpha presence wilting under the combined force of the bond and the pyre's magic. He stepped back, but his eyes promised murder. The political battle lines in that moment were drawn in fire. The golden pillar of flame began to recede, not snuffing out, but sinking back into the brazier until it was a steady, basketball-sized orb of swirling gold. The secondary light from the floor engravings faded, leaving the noble crests permanently dull. The magic had done its work. The hall fell into a seething, hostile quiet. Alistair knew he had seconds to establish control. He addressed the room, his arm around Ilara's cloaked form. The ritual of flames is complete. The gods have spoken in a tongue we had forgotten. This woman, he paused, realizing he didn't even know her name. Ilara, she whispered, so quietly only he could hear. Ilara, Alistair announced, the name feeling inevitable on his tongue, is my fated mate, and by the ancient laws your queen. The transition of power is absolute and immediate. But absolute power in a medieval kingdom requires infrastructure, and Ilara had none. No ladies-in-waiting, no family allies, no understanding of court etiquette, no wardrobe, not even a room to call her own. She was a queen who, an hour ago, slept in a drafty attic above the pastry ovens. Alistair issued a flurry of orders to his personal guard, bypassing Thaddeus entirely. Ilara was to be taken to the royal wing. Her old quarters were to be sealed. Her person was to be protected by the king's own guards, not the palace household staff. It was a clear message. He trusted no one. As Ilara was led away, shrouded in the king's cloak, she glanced back once. Her eyes met those of Lady Seraphina, the noble Omega from the Eastern Vale who had been rejected just last year. The lady's expression wasn't one of anger, but of dawning, horrified understanding. She curtsied, deep and genuine. She, unlike the men, felt the truth in the magic. The first crisis hit before dawn. Ilara, overwhelmed and in shock, was given a bath and a simple linen shift to wear. The royal seamstresses were summoned in a panic, but when a senior maid tried to remove the simple leather cord from around Ilara's neck, the one holding a tarnished copper locket, her only possession from her dead mother, Ilara reacted on instinct. She snatched it back. The maid, affronted, reported to the head of household, who reported to Thaddeus, who saw an opportunity to reassert control. He arrived at Ilara's temporary chambers, declaring the peasant charm unfit for a queen and demanding it be locked away for inspection. Ilara, cornered and desperate, did the only thing she could think of. She clutched the locket to her chest and said, "The king instructed me to keep my personal effects." It was a lie, but when the guard at her door, one of Alistair's men, heard Thaddeus arguing with her, he stepped inside. "The king's orders are final," the guard stated. his hand on his sword hilt. Thaddeus was forced to retreat. Ilara had won her first, tiny battle, not through authority, but through the reflected power of her mate's command. She learned a crucial lesson. In this world, Alistair's will was the only shield she had. Meanwhile, Alistair was in his war room with his most trusted commanders and a now terrified Thaddeus, who had brought the archival scrolls. The news was grim. The texts spoke of the golden ignition in vague, prophetic terms. It was called the Great Leveling, the unmaking of blood, a reset button for a corrupt aristocracy. The dimmed crests weren't just for show. They meant the ancestral magic that granted those houses control over their lands, magic that made crops grow, that calmed fierce beasts in their forests, that fortified their castle walls, was severed. Their power was now purely mundane, military, economic, but no longer divine. This isn't just about a queen, Alistair growled, looking at a map of the kingdom. This is a transfer of divine mandate. The magic has flowed from their bloodlines back to the central throne, to asterisk her asterisk. He slammed his fist on the table. Cedric won't just want the crown, he'll want to kill her to see if the magic returns to the nobles. As if on cue, a report arrived. Lord Cedric had left the capital in the night with his entire retinue, not for his own lands, but for the fortified city of Volta, the stronghold of House Grenville, whose crest had been the first to dim. He was gathering the disaffected. A rebellion was no longer a risk, it was a fact in its infancy. But the most shocking revelation came from Thaddeus, who was peering at a fragile scroll with a magnifying glass. Your Majesty, the prophecy, it mentions the golden flame choosing the unseen seed. It says the magic will not just level, but reveal. He looked up, his face bloodless. It says the true power of the flame is to unveil hidden blood. Before Alistair could demand an explanation, a guardsman burst in. Sire, it's the Queen, you must come. In her chamber, Ilara was in the middle of another confrontation. The royal seamstress, a woman who had dressed generations of noble ladies, had brought preliminary gowns. They were all wrong, heavy brocades, stiff silks, designed for someone who stood still and looked decorative. Ilara, used to moving to working, found them suffocating. Frustrated, she had absent-mindedly touched the simple gold flame still burning in the small brazier they'd brought to her room, a symbolic link to the main pyre. As her fingers neared the fire, the flame leaned toward her like a plant toward the sun. A gasp went around the room. Then the locket at her chest grew warm. Startled, Ilara fumbled with the clasp. The tarnished copper fell open. Inside was not a portrait, but a tiny, folded piece of vellum. With trembling hands, she pulled it out. It was a seal, a crest, pressed not in wax, but in dried, ancient blood that now began to glow with a soft, silver light. The seamstress, who knew every noble sigil in the realm, let out a shriek and fell into a deep curtsy. Alistair arrived just as Ilara was smoothing the vellum on a table. The crest showed a mountain peak struck by a single bolt of lightning. It was the lost sigil of House Cinderfall, a house not just noble, but royal. A house supposedly wiped out to the last child over 50 years ago in the war that put Alistair's own grandfather on the throne. The stories said they were traitors. The stories said they were extinct. The glowing blood seal was proof. Ilara wasn't just a kitchen maid. She was the last surviving scion of a rival royal line, hidden in the kitchens as an orphan to keep her alive. The mate's pyre hadn't chosen a commoner. It had chosen a lost princess, forcing a reconciliation of bloodlines the kingdom had tried to erase. The unseen seed had been unveiled. Alistair stared at the crest, then at Ilara, seeing her completely anew. This changed everything. It gave her a claim, however dangerous, that the nobility couldn't simply ignore, but it also made her a target in a new and more terrifying way. Cedric didn't just fear a loss of power now, he would see her as living proof of his own family's potential illegitimacy. He took her hand. Do you understand what this means? Ilara looked at the glowing seal, then at the golden flame still dancing for her. The fear in her eyes was being slowly replaced by a hard, determined light. It means they can't call me a nobody anymore, she said, her voice quiet but steady. And it means this was never an accident. At that moment in the city of Volta, Lord Cedric was holding his own council. He had the scrolls too, he knew the prophecies, and he had come to a very different, more ruthless conclusion. The magic has flowed back to the throne, he told the assembled, disgruntled lords, but the throne is just a chair. The power is in the blood of the one it chose. We don't need to win a war against the king's army. We just need to cut the new branch from the family tree. Kill the queen, and the divine mandate will have to find a new vessel. He smiled, a cruel, calculated thing. And with the king's line proven barren by the flame for generations, where do you suppose it will look next? He unrolled a map, pointing not at the capital, but at a remote, unmarked location near the border. My agents have already found where they hid her. The scullery was a front. She was trained, perhaps, by the remnants of House Cinderfall. This is a deep, old plot, but every plot has a weakness. He leaned forward. And hers is that she still thinks like a servant. She won't expect an attack from within the palace itself. The attack came not from a shadowy assassin in the night, but with the morning tea. A young kitchen boy, face pale and hands shaking, was allowed through the Queen's Guard checkpoint. He carried a silver tray with a porcelain pot of mint tea and honey cakes, a customary breakfast. Ilara, unable to sleep, was sitting by the window. The boy, whose name was Finn, avoided her eyes. As he set the tray down, his sleeve caught the pot's handle. It tipped. Scalding tea poured toward Ilara's lap. Instinctively, she jerked back. But Finn, in a frantic move to right the pot, shoved the entire tray off the table. It clattered to the floor. The porcelain pot shattered. And from within the double-layered silver tray, a hidden compartment sprang open, revealing a small, dried nightshade berry coated in a sticky resin. It was wolfsbane, the deadliest poison to their kind, undetectable in food until it was far too late. Finn fell to his knees, sobbing. He hadn't known. A man had paid his mother's debts. He was just to deliver the tray and ensure the Queen took the first cup. The method was brutally clever. Use the established routine, exploit the one point of contact still staffed by the old household, and frame an accident if discovered. The guards seized Finn. Interrogation was swift and merciless. The trail led to the understeward of the kitchens, a man deep in Lord Cedric's pocket. But the understeward was found in his quarters, his throat cut, a forged letter in his hand suggesting the plot was his alone, a disgruntled employee loyal to the old noble order. Alastair's rage was a silent, terrifying thing. He didn't shout. He stood in Ilara's solar, looking at the poisonous berry in a glass jar. "They will try again," he said, his voice flat. "And again, you cannot live in a cage." He made a decision. Ilara's protection could no longer be passive. She needed to become a liability to attack. That afternoon, he took her to the royal armory, not to choose a weapon, but to have one made. The royal blacksmith, a grizzled old wolf who had forged swords for 3 kings, was presented with an impossible task: create armor for a queen that didn't exist. Ilara stood silently as they took her measurements, but as the smith discussed lightweight ceremonial plating, she spoke up. "I don't know how to move in plate, but I know how to move in a kitchen. I need to bend, to reach, to run." She pointed to a roll of supple, dark leather used for horse tack and to a shirt of fine, gleaming chainmail. "Could you make something like a butcher's apron? But with this," she was designing her own defense based on the only physical labor she knew. The blacksmith was stunned, then intrigued. Alastair watched, that proud, fierce light in his eyes again. The result was not a knight's armor, nor a noblewoman's gown. It was a hybrid. A reinforced leather bodice lined with fine mail, articulated at the joints for movement, worn over practical tunics and trousers. It was unmistakably regal in its craftsmanship, yet utterly functional. When Ilara put it on for the first time, she didn't look like a queen playing soldier. She looked like a survivor who had been granted the tools to fight back. The message was sent. The queen from the kitchens would not be a porcelain doll on a shelf. But while Ilara was learning to wear armor, the kingdom's magic was continuing its silent revolution. Reports began flooding in from the provinces. In the Eastern Vale, Lady Seraphina's lands, the legendary apple orchards that bloomed year-round under her family's crest magic, were withering. The fruit grew small and sour. In the silver mines of House Grenville, new tunnels collapsed, as if the earth itself had grown unstable. The common people, who depended on this noble magic for bountiful harvests and safe passage, were the first to feel the loss. Fear turned to anger, and that anger needed a target. Lord Cedric's propaganda machine was ready. Messengers and town criers in his allied territories began spreading a new, vicious narrative. The golden flame wasn't a blessing. It was a curse unleashed by a false queen. The kitchen maid wasn't a lost princess of Cinderfall. That was a pathetic lie concocted by the king to justify his madness. No, she was a witch, a bloodline of traitors who had now used dark magic to steal the realm's vitality for herself. Look at your dying fields, they said. Look at your failing mines. She is drinking the magic of the land to feed her own power. It was a masterstroke. It turned Ilara's very existence into the cause of the people's suffering. Petitions began arriving at the capital, not from nobles, but from guilds and village elders, begging the king to set things right, to restore the old magic. The public sentiment, which might have been curious or even supportive of a Cinderella story, was being poisoned. Thaddeus, the master of ceremonies, now saw the kingdom crumbling from two fronts, Cedric's rebellion and a potential peasant uprising. He came to Alastair with a desperate, historic proposal. The coronation of the Golden Mate, he said, unrolling an ancient scroll. It's not just a ceremony, it's a test, a final public ratification by the land itself. If she is true, if the Flame's choice is valid, the coronation ritual at the Stone of Kings will cause the land to acknowledge her. It might stabilize the magic, he hesitated, and if she is false or unworthy, the stone will reject her, publicly, fatally. It was a gamble of existential proportions. Succeed, and Ilara's legitimacy would be cemented, the magical decay might halt. Fail, and she would die, proving Cedric right and leaving Alastair utterly broken. Ilara, overhearing the plan from the doorway, didn't wait for Alastair to decide. "We do it," she said. Her voice held no hesitation. "I am done being their target. Let their magic stone try to reject me. I've faced worse than a rock." Preparations began in secret. The coronation would be in 1 week at the sacred site, a day's ride from the capital. Security would be a nightmare, but the real crisis hit 3 days before the ceremony. Ilara, trying to learn the complex coronation vows, was visited by a hooded figure smuggled into the palace by a sympathetic guard. It was an old woman, her face a map of wrinkles, her eyes milky with cataracts. She was introduced as Agnes, the last surviving oath-keeper of House Cinderfall. She had been the infant Ilara's wet nurse, the one who had switched her with a dead pauper's child and hidden the locket. Agnes's story was not one of glorious survival. It was a tale of betrayal from within. House Cinderfall hadn't been wiped out by Alastair's grandfather in open war. They had been murdered in their sleep by their own allies, the Grenvilles and Cedric's own father, during a peace summit. Their crime? They had discovered the source of the Mate's Pyre's power and had sought to share it with all bloodlines, not just the king. The Pyre wasn't just a matchmaking tool. It was a limiter, a valve on the land's magic, designed to keep 90% of it funneled through the royal mate to control the nobles. The dimming wasn't a punishment by the flame. It was the system working as designed for the first time in centuries, because for the first time, the mate had the latent, unbound Cinderfall blood that could handle the full flow. "The Stone of Kings won't test your worth, child," Agnes whispered, her claw-like hand gripping Ilara. "It will test your intent. It will ask you a question only a Cinderfall can answer correctly. Do you hoard or do you feed? If you choose power for yourself, to be a queen above all, the stone will consume you. If you choose to be a conduit, to let the magic flow back to the land and its people, you will unlock what my family died for." This changed everything. The coronation wasn't just about legitimacy, it was an ideological weapon. Cedric and the old nobles wanted to kill Ilara to restore the limited, controlled magic that privileged them. Ilara, if she passed the stone's test, could unleash a torrent of magic that would break their control forever. The stakes were no longer about a crown, but about the fundamental nature of power in the realm. On the eve of the coronation ride, as the royal column was preparing, the final, brutal twist came. Alastair's spies intercepted a coded message from within Cedric's camp. It wasn't a plan to attack the coronation. It was a receipt. Cedric had secured the services of the Shadow Hounds, a mercenary company of non-werewolf assassins, immune to alpha commands and skilled in killing magical beings. Their price, not gold, a sovereign promise. In the event of his victory, Cedric would grant them the right to hunt freely in the kingdom's forests, forests currently protected by the very land magic that was fading. The message ended with a chilling postscript. Primary target is the queen. Secondary target is the king's bond. Sever it during the ritual for maximum effect. They didn't just want to kill Ilara. They wanted to magically wound Alastair so deeply at the moment of her death that he would be crippled, unable to rally. It was a plan of exquisite cruelty. Alastair showed the message to Ilara in the map room. She read it, her face calm. Then she walked to the brazier holding her small golden flame. She held her hand over it. The flame leaped to her palm, dancing harmlessly. "They think my power is something to be stolen or severed," she said, watching the fire. "They don't understand. It's not in me. I'm just standing in the river. Tomorrow, at the stone, I'm going to open the floodgates. And Cedric and his shadow hounds are going to find out what happens to those who try to dam a river that's decided to flow." She turned to Alastair, the golden light reflecting in her eyes. "You unified the Border Lords with force. Tomorrow, I will unite the kingdom with a truth they tried to bury, and you will be by my side, not as my shield, but as my king. The first king in 200 years whose mate doesn't just hold power, but understands it." The journey to the Stone of Kings began at first light, a queen in leather and mail riding toward a destiny that would either save a kingdom or drown it in the magic it had forgotten. The Stone of Kings wasn't a throne, it was a sentinel, a single weathered obelisk of black granite that stood in the center of a windswept highland plain, carved with runes so old even the scholars couldn't read them. It was said the first wolf had howled the realm into existence at this spot. As the royal procession approached, the scale of the gamble became terrifyingly clear. Thousands had gathered, not just nobles and soldiers, but common folk from every corner of Valerium. They stood in silent, anxious clusters, their fates tied to the magic in the stone and the woman riding toward it. On one flank of the plain, Alastair's royal guard formed a disciplined, silver-clad line. On the opposite rise, under a banner bearing his personal crest, stood Lord Cedric with his coalition of disaffected lords and a contingent of grim, non-human mercenaries, the Shadow Hounds. The air wasn't just cold, it was charged, waiting for a spark. Ilara dismounted, her Leathian mail armor looking both alien and appropriate against the ancient backdrop. She carried no scepter, only the small, contained golden flame in a lantern held by a solemn priest. Alastair walked beside her, a king without his crown for this ceremony, his presence a solid wall of support. As they reached the circle of crushed white stone surrounding the obelisk, Thaddeus began the rites. His voice trembled. He spoke of lineage, of duty, of the mantle of rule. But everyone knew the real ritual hadn't begun. Then the stone woke up. The ancient runes began to glow with a soft, blue-white light, the same hue as the mate's pyre before it had turned gold. A low hum vibrated through the ground, up through the soles of every boot. Thaddeus finished and stepped back, his part done. Now it was between the stone and the queen. Ilara approached alone. She set the lantern with her golden flame at the base of the obelisk. The two lights, the blue-white of the stone and the gold of her flame, didn't merge. They seemed to assess each other, a voice, not heard with ears but felt in the bones of every magic-sensitive being present, echoed across the plain. It was the voice of the land itself, ancient and weary. "State your claim, child of Turmoil." Ilara took a deep breath. She didn't recite the prepared vows. She spoke as herself. "I claim nothing. I was brought here by desperation and a fire that saw something no one else did." The stone's light pulsed. The flame chooses the vessel. The stone tests the intent. Why do you seek the crown? This was the question Agnes had warned about, the trap. If she spoke of power, of ruling, of her right, she would fail. Ilara looked out at the sea of faces, the fearful nobles, the hopeful commoners, the hostile rebels. She thought of the withering orchards and the collapsing mines. She didn't see subjects. She saw people whose lives were unraveling because of a magic they didn't understand. "I don't seek a crown," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the silent plain. "I seek to fix a leak. The magic is bleeding out of the land because it's been held in too few hands for too long. I'm here to open my hands." The stone's hum deepened. The blue-white light intensified, becoming blinding. To take or to give. Ilara didn't hesitate. To give. She reached out and placed her bare palms flat against the cold, rough granite of the obelisk. The world dissolved into light and sound. The golden flame from her lantern roared up, meeting the blue-white light from the stone. Where they met, a new color was born, a vibrant, living emerald green. This green light exploded outwards in a wave, shooting across the plain, through the crowd, and racing toward the horizon like a ripple on a pond. Where it touched the people, they gasped. A warm, revitalizing energy washed over them. But where it touched Lord Cedric and the nobles whose crests had dimmed, it burned like ice. They cried out, stumbling back. The green wave reached the distant forests, the orchards, the mines. Back in the Eastern Vale, Lady Seraphina, who had stayed at her estate, felt a jolt. She ran to her balcony. The withered apple trees in the courtyard were trembling. Before her eyes, new buds swelled and burst into bloom, not the enchanted everbloom of before, but a healthy, natural spring bloom filled with frantic bees. The land was healing, but on its own terms, no longer chained to a noble's will. At the stone, the vision wasn't over. The emerald light coalesced above the obelisk, forming a shimmering, spectral image, a massive, majestic wolf with a coat like carved emerald. It was the spirit of the land, unseen for centuries. It looked down at Ilara, then turned its gaze to the gathered crowd. Its voice was the wind through every tree, the water in every stream. The balance is restored, the lock is broken, the magic returns to the soil, to the stone, to the blood of all who tend it. Not a prize for the highborn, but a birthright for the diligent. The queen is the conduit, not the container. She opens the way, you must walk it. Then the spectral wolf looked directly at Lord Cedric's position. The hunter of shadows becomes the hunted. The plotter is plotted against. On the ridge, chaos erupted. The shadow hounds, the mercenaries Cedric had hired, didn't draw their weapons on the king's guard. They turned on Cedric's own nobles. Their contract, as intercepted, had a hidden clause they'd negotiated with Alistair's spies days prior, amnesty and land for betraying the traitor. Cedric screamed in rage as his flank collapsed into internal warfare. He drew his sword, not toward the chaos, but toward the stone, toward Ilara. With a roar of pure spite, he broke from his crumbling line and charged across the plain, a handful of his most fanatical knights following. Alistair moved to intercept, but Ilara's voice stopped him. She still had her hands on the stone. No, the land will handle this. As Cedric's horse pounded across the white stone circle, the ground itself reacted. Grass and wildflowers erupted from the barren rock at impossible speed, tangling the horse's legs. Vines, thick as cables, shot from the earth, wrapping around Cedric, pulling him from his saddle. He landed hard, his sword clattering away. He struggled, but the very soil held him fast, hardening around him like stone. He was trapped not by guards, but by the awakened land that rejected his greed. The few knights with him were similarly ensnared. The fight was over without a single royal soldier lifting a blade. The emerald light slowly faded from the sky, settling into a gentle, permanent glow within the runes of the Stone of Kings. The connection severed, Ilara staggered back, her hands numb. Alistair was there, catching her. She looked up at him, exhausted but radiant. "It's done," she whispered. "The river is flowing." The coronation that followed was unlike any in history. There was no heavy crown of gold and jewels. Using metal forged in the combined light of the golden flame and the emerald stone, the blacksmith created a simple, elegant circlet of intertwined silver and living, petrified vine. When Thaddeus placed it on Ilara's head, a final, gentle pulse of green light spread out, and every person on the plain, from the highest lord to the lowest farmer, felt a warm, affirming touch on their shoulder, the land acknowledging their place in the new balance. In the weeks that followed, the changes were profound but not instantaneous. The magic didn't return to the noble crests. Instead, it flourished in places of communal effort and care. A village that worked together to rebuild a bridge found the wood stronger and the river calmer. A farmer who sang to his crops saw them thrive. The power was no longer aristocratic. It was democratic, earned by action rather than blood. Lord Cedric and his co-conspirators were not executed. They were given a sentence that to them was worse than death: exile. Stripped of their titles and any claim to lands that no longer recognized their blood, they were sent across the sea, their connection to the magical land of Valerium permanently severed. They would live as ordinary men, a fate their pride could never survive. Ilara and Alistair's rule became a partnership that defined a new era. He handled the military and diplomatic strategy. She, with her innate understanding of systems and flows from her kitchen days, oversaw the redistribution of resources and the new fair tax codes that replaced the magical tithes of old. The palace kitchens, where she had once scrubbed pots, became the headquarters for the Queen's Grant, a program that funded communal projects across the realm. But the final, surprising detail came a year later, during the first anniversary of the coronation. Ilara, now visibly pregnant, was walking in the palace gardens with Alastair when she felt a familiar pull. She led him to a secluded, sunny patch of earth. There, a new sapling was growing. It had shot up overnight, its bark shimmering with a faint, opalescent light. At its base, two distinct types of flowers bloomed, one the deep blue of the original mate's pyre flame, the other the vibrant green of the stone of kings. Entwined around the sapling's trunk was a vine of silver leaves. The tree was a living symbol of their union, a fusion of both their magics, and it was just the first. Reports began coming in from across the kingdom, similar fusion trees sprouting in places of harmony and growth. The land wasn't just healed, it was creating something new, something that had never existed before. The legacy of the kitchen maid queen and the warrior king was literally taking root, changing the very flora of the realm. As they stood hand in hand, looking at their tree, Alastair rested his other hand on her rounded stomach. He or she will never know the world of dimmed crests and desperate rituals, he murmured. Ilara smiled, leaning into him. They'll know a better one where the fire doesn't choose who rules, it just helps light the way for everyone. The journey from the scullery sink to the Stone of Kings was complete, not by conquering the old world, but by planting the seeds for a new one. The tale of the Golden Flame is more than a story about a queen. It's a blueprint for what happens when a system becomes so rigid, so obsessed with its own rules, that it forgets its purpose. For 200 years, the kingdom of Valerium was trapped in a cycle of diminishing returns, searching for magic in the same pedigreed bloodlines, blind to the truth that was literally washing dishes in the basement. The moment of Ilara's selection wasn't just a romantic twist of fate, it was a systemic correction, a divine intervention for a society that had confused privilege for merit and bloodline for worth. Alastair and Ilara's legacy wasn't built on conquest, but on restoration. They didn't conquer the old nobles, they made their power irrelevant. By returning magic to the land as a common birthright, they created a kingdom where farmers' care could wield as much influence as a lord's decree. The new sapling in the garden, fused from two magics, is the perfect symbol. It represents a future that is hybrid, resilient, and growing from a foundation of true partnership. The old world asked, "What can you claim?" The new world asks, "What can you contribute?" This story resonates because it taps into a universal fantasy, the idea that our lowest point, our most overlooked moment, might actually be the prelude to our greatest purpose, that the very traits a broken system discards, resilience, practicality, a willingness to get your hands dirty, are the exact tools needed to rebuild it. Ilara didn't win because she learned to play the noble's game. She won because she changed the game entirely, using the skills she'd always had. So the lingering question isn't about kingdoms or magic flames, it's about our own worlds. What systems are you trapped in that measure you by the wrong metrics? What value is lying dormant, overlooked, because it doesn't fit the established pedigree? And what would it take for your own golden flame moment, not to crown you as royalty, but to reveal the unique power you were always meant to wield? The downfall of Silas Blackwood in our original story was satisfying because it was karmic, but the rise of Ilara is inspirational because it was transformative. She didn't just get revenge, she built something better, proving that true power isn't about standing above others, but about standing for something that elevates everyone. If this journey from the ashes of rejection to the throne of a new era captivated you, do me a huge favor. Smash that like button, it tells the algorithm stories like this matter. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that their current chapter isn't their whole story. And subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell, because we are just getting started uncovering the epic tales of twist, fate, and hidden power waiting to be told. Let me know in the comments what part of Ilara's transformation resonated most with you. Until next time, remember, sometimes the most powerful magic is the potential everyone else has forgotten to see.